Good afternoon. My name is Christopher Garman. I am joined by my colleague Silvio Cascione, and we have the immense pleasure to be able to end the G0 Latin America Summit with a conversation with the Minister of Economy, Paulo Guedes. The moment is an important one. We're very thankful for him to be able to give us this time and have this conversation with us. The structure of this conversation, we're going to ask the Minister to begin with some of his opening remarks over how he sees the outlook in Brazil. Both myself and Silvio Cascione will then follow up with some questions. But please, if you have any questions that you want to be able to address the Minister, type them in the chat function, and myself and Silvio can read them and bring them up in the conversation where possible. But once again, Minister, thank you so much for joining us in that conversation. And the floor is yours for the opening remarks.
Thank you. Nice meeting you again, Chris. Hello, everybody. The first remarks I would make would be with respect to the fiscal position in Brazil. It has been a lot of noise. We really spent money with direct income transfers, with job preservation programs. I think we were successful in making the economy rebound at a fast speed. The first estimates were pretty dark about Brazil. People were estimating a drop of around 10% in GDP. The IMF came here and made this forecast. I was very skeptical of that forecast. I made it very clear at that time that I thought that Brazil would drop less, recover faster, and I think we were successful. We preserved 11 million jobs. We transferred income to 68 million Brazilians. It was the first time that we had a GDP drop of that intensity, 4.1%, and we didn't have losses in the formal markets. So we think that not only we dropped less, but we rebounded faster, and we are now coming back to a safe return to work. So Brazil is growing around 5%, a little higher than 5% this year. And the impressive thing, I say impressive because we just finished the numbers 2 or 3 days ago, and I was impressed. Even I was impressed because we came here spending 19.5% of GDP in our first year. And the second year, we went to, because of COVID, we went to 26.5. So federal spending as a percentage of GDP went to 26.5. And we are now back to 19.5, and forecast for next year would be 17.5 if it were not for the expansion of the social programs. With the expansion of social programs, we will drop next year to 18.5. So it will be the first government that is getting out, spending less than when we came. The same numbers, these are hard facts. So you hear a lot of noise about fiscal sustainability in Brazil, how the fiscal policies lose, and I can assure you, this is noise. I always told that there is information, there is signal, and there is noise. Politics is making a lot of noise in Brazil. But the information, the real signal, is that we came here again. The last number of the last government was primary deficit of 2% of GDP. So in our very first year, we cut it down by half. So in 2019, we reduced the primary deficit from 2% of GDP to 1% of GDP. Then we were hit by COVID. We went to 10.5 of GDP. So we spent twice as much as the emerging economies, and we spent 10% more than the average of the advanced economies. So it really was a very decisive move to preserve jobs and to save lives. We transferred income to states and municipalities. We sustained direct income transfers to 68 million Brazilians. We paid for the vaccines. We paid for the job preservation programs that preserved 11 million jobs, 1/3 of the formal private labor market. So next year, what happens, which is 2021, just 3-4 days ago, we closed the numbers. We are back to 1% of GDP. No country in the world has done such a contractionary fiscal policy. So no country in the world has reduced the deficit, not previously in history. Not previously in history. It's not only contemporaneous world facing COVID, it's previously at any time, coming back from 10.5 to 1% of GDP, which means that we are exactly where we were in our first year of government. So exactly like we said, we preserved a double commitment. On one hand, all the money that is necessary for health, but on the other hand, respect for the future generations. So we launched several programs, credit programs, job preservation programs, direct income transfer programs, but all of them contracted, phased out, and we are back to 1% of GDP. And forecast for next year, we close the numbers, even after the expansion of the social programs, with the basic income, family income program that we just established. The forecast for next year is 0.5% of primary deficit. So I would like, my first remarks would be about the fiscal situation, because you hear a lot of noise, but these are hard facts. And the number that I'm giving you is 0.5%. Is of course just a forecast for next year, but with all relevant information we have at the moment, including the judiciary order, constitutional amendment that we just are about to approve. So go ahead, Chris, with any other question.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Minister. And that's a very important way to begin this conversation. And let me follow up exactly on that point. I certainly absolutely hear you that when you look at the fiscal results, the outcome probably has been much better than what market participants were forecasting just 6 to 8 months ago. But given a relatively good performance, how would you look at the potential for new adjustments on fiscal policy over the course of the year of 2022? Let me kind of break up that question maybe in 2 parts. Number one, are you confident that Congress will approve the new spending cap reform, or the precatório spec, by the end of this year? I mean, maybe that's just more of a political question. That's how you're seeing negotiations in Congress. And the second part of the question is, heading into an election year, and now with concerns of the Omicron variant, could you envision kind of making adjustments to the amount of spending that's budgeted in the 2022 budget over the course of next year? Or is the additional spending that was approved in PAC 23 is what you see, what you get for next year?
Well, we are pretty much on what you see is what you get. Of course, we will fight very hard for that. It is very important to understand that we had a budget and we had a social program that was tailor-made to fit the budget inside the spending cap and the ceiling, inside the fiscal responsibility law. It was all tailor-made to preserve the fiscal fundamentals. Then we had a problem. We had a big surprise with the judiciary orders, which, you know, from a fiscal viewpoint, to us, we were committed with transforming or at least controlling the future path of public expenditures. Because since we came here, our diagnosis was very clear. Most problems and dysfunctions that Brazil had in the past were symptoms or side effects of the lack of control over public spending. So Brazil had two bursts of hyperinflation. Brazil went to external debt moratorium. Brazil went to very severe recessions, and always in the background was the lack of control on public spending. Two-digit interest rates, very high tax rates, low growth, and even corruption in politics. All these were side effects of the uncontrollable paths of future spending. 4 decades ago, the size of the government was 18% of GDP. So around 40 years, 10 years of military government, and then 30 years of democracy, social democrats in power. What happened is that expenditures went from 18% of GDP to 45% of GDP. So the government was spending a lot of money and spending unwisely. So when we came here, the idea was, let's control the future path of these public expenditures in all dimensions. So we attacked, the first dimension we attacked was exactly the social security. We removed all the privileges and we recovered control. It was more than $150 billion, almost $200 billion reform. And in 10 years, we shaved off $200 billion in 10 years, 12 years of increased expenditures in social security. Then we went for the second major source of expenditures with a balance sheet repair program. We deleveraged public banks, made them pay their debts to the union. At the same time, we sold 250 billion reais, little more than $40 billion, in state companies, subsidiaries of state companies. And now we are coming with the big ones. Petrobras, the largest generation and transmission of energy in Latin America, and also postal service. So we are coming now with the big guys. And we use all this in a stock sense, in a balance sheet sense, repairing the balance sheet of the union. That's why most forecasts about Brazil, the trajectory of the debt GDP ratio went wrong. Most economists said, well, the debt GDP ratio will get to 100%. Now it's 80%. So it's a 20% miss. The forecasters in Brazil made it wrong by 20% of GDP, which is is more than $400 billion. So it's a lot of money. And their mistake came exactly because they did not understand our balance sheet repair program. Deleveraging public banks all the time and selling state companies and putting down the ratio of GDP, of debt to GDP. So you don't need to generate a primary surplus to make a balance sheet repair. It's exactly like a private company. You can just divest some of your investments, you divest them and you pay back the bank and you reduce your debt GDP ratio. That's exactly what we did. So we could not wait for 4 years to generate a primary surplus. We were in a hurry. So we divested. Not only a balance sheet repair in the stock dimension, but in a flow dimension. We also changed the doses of monetary and fiscal policy. We went tighter fiscal and easier money. So not only we reduced the debt GDP ratio, but interest rates collapsed. And then we also shaved 100 billion reais a year in interest payments. This was the second largest component of public expenditures. And the third largest component was the wage bill of public employees. So again, we were very decisive and very daring because in the midst of the pandemics, we knew this third source of uncontrollable public spending. Just imagine, in the last 17 years, the wages of public employees went 50% above inflation. 50% above inflation. They were entirely out of line with their counterparts in the private sector. So what we did was exactly, okay, we'll send all the money that is necessary for health, but we will interrupt briefly for 1.5 years all wage readjustments in the public sector. It doesn't make sense if you are at home with a good wage, with stability of employment, home office, working by home office. It doesn't make sense to ask for wage increases. So we have frozen the wage bill for 2 years at all levels, federal, state, and municipalities. What happened when you de-index wages for 2 years in Brazil? All public finances went incredibly better. So probably the aggregate government, when you put now state companies, federal level, state level, and municipalities, for the first time since 2013, there will be a general surplus in the government, in the consolidation of the public sector, which is really something that didn't happen for the last 8 years, exactly because we froze the wages for 1.5 years. So all municipalities are plenty of cash, all states are plenty of cash, all of them have been re-ranked in terms of financial statements and balance sheets. So it was really an achievement. It was a very important achievement. And when we had it all fixed under the ceiling with the social programs, respecting the fiscal responsibility law and the spending cap, then we got a big surprise, which was the precatorio, what we call the judiciary order, the precatorio, that they jumped from 10 billion, 9 years ago, to 20 billion, 35 billion, 40 billion, and then suddenly 100% increase to 90 billion. So we have no problem. And this has been very misinterpreted in Brazil. Again, a lot of political noise. People said it is a default when it is exactly the contrary of a default. It's exactly what we did with the Social Security. To prevent a future default in Social Security, we shaved off privileges. This time, we didn't even shave off anything at all. We just said, listen, to prevent a default in judiciary orders, we have to respect the ceiling. So it was exactly the contrary of what was said. We demanded, we requested through a constitutional amendment that all expenditures, not only the previous expenditures that we just controlled, but also the orders that come from another independent power, which is the judiciary, they also must respect the ceiling. So it was a really big confusion, because at the same time, the lower house and a group of ministers decided to propose a revision of the ceiling. So you mixed up everything. On one side, we were submitting the orders, the judiciary orders and bonds that come from the judiciary power to the ceiling. This is our constitutional amendment. Let's submit it to the ceiling. So there's no default whatsoever. This just will pay it, but we cannot risk a complete lack of control over expenditures. So we don't judge the merit of the decisions of the judiciary power, but we also expect that they observe the constitutional amendment that says that we must respect the ceiling. So we will follow through with your decisions, but we pay them orderly. We'll pay them orderly. So not only we will pay all of them that are under a certain, let's say, benchmark, justice for the little Brazilians, for the little guys, up to 60 times the minimum wage will be paid immediately. But the big guys, the big lawyers, officers in Brazil, the big financiers that have billionaire funds of judiciaries. If you go on the streets in Brasilia, you see, we buy your judiciary bonds, please sell them to us. I pay them, I buy with discount. So there is almost an industry in Brazil of this thing. So we must submit this to the general state of the law, which is the constitutional amendment that imposes on us the demands of all of us respecting the ceiling. So when we were moving to submit all expenditures to the ceiling, unfortunately, there was a big discussion about reviewing the ceiling. So they put everything together and said, well, it is a default, and at the same time, they are trespassing the ceiling, trespassing the spending cap. When it was the contrary, we were just exactly submitting the independent power, which is the judiciary. They are free to give us their orders to execute, but we must execute them properly. And most important of all, we need controllability. We need predictability. We need to know what the number can be next year, and the year after next year, and the year after next year. So it's all about controlling the future path of expenditures. So now we know that next year it cannot jump 100% anymore. It has to go exactly growing with the ceiling. So this is number one. Now the judiciary bonds are submitted to the ceiling, so they don't jump anymore. Now they go from 48 to 51, 51 to 53 billion, 57 billion. So it's entirely predictable. Number one. Number two, are you reviewing the ceiling? Well, I preferred at that time when the question came to me, I said, I prefer to ask for a waiver than reviewing the ceiling. But you know, we are in a democracy. And people said, well, we prefer to review the ceiling. And what is the reason? And technically is very acceptable. The ceiling goes from 1st of July to 1st of July of next year. And the expenditures, the budget is executed 1st of January to 1st of January of next year. So there is a mismatching. So when inflation is going higher, you're going to spend more on Social Security, you're going to spend more on health, on education. But the ceiling does not allow you to do that, which is entirely reasonable because you are not increasing expenditures in real terms. It's just because inflation went higher. So we just synchronized the ceiling with the spending so that if expenditures, if inflation is going higher and we're spending more because of inflation, it's not in real terms, it's just nominal, it's going higher. So the ceiling goes higher. Next year, inflation goes down, you are spending less, the ceiling goes down. So we just synchronized it. Is it true that it opened an additional space? Yes, it is true. Is it politically interesting and opportunistic, quote unquote? Yes, it is. But we immediately fill that space with very unavoidable expenditures that would happen anyway. For instance, 20 billion in vaccines that were going to happen outside the ceiling. So we immediately push it down to the ceiling. Another 20 billion, 28 billion, social security expenditures, wage expenditures, so things that would happen anyway. So it was not an increase in real expenditures, just nominal. So this is very important because then you understand why people talk a lot of things about how uncontrollable the fiscal situation in Brazil. And when you go to the data is 10.5 of primary deaths in 2020, 1% in 2021, and 0.5% in 2022.
No, fantastic. No, very much appreciate that, Minister. Very important to make that very clear. Let me follow up, though, with two very specific questions, if you could give us a bit of color on. The first is, if Congress does not agree, if the lower house does not agree to approve the full version of the precatório SPEC before the end of the year, in other words, that Congress approves just what was kind of approved in common between the two houses, and the part that the Senate changed has to go through committee appraisal, right? I'm sure if you can give us insights on this. But if we have this type of scenario, what would be the administration's plans in a context where only part of the additional funding is approved by the end of the year? That's question number one. And question number two, Minister, how are you thinking about the potential for a new wave of COVID-19? What are the things that the administration will be looking out for if we do have another surge of cases and potential hospitalizations that could lead to additional extraordinary expenses in 2022? Give us a sense over kind of what are the markers that the administration is looking at from a public health point of view.
Okay, Chris. Number one, we really are very optimistic about the understanding of the Congress of how serious the situation is and how necessary the judiciary bond, the constitutional amendment is for our fiscal sustainability program. Like I said before, we lived like 2 or 3 months of an incredible noise, misunderstanding, political opportunism on both sides, exploration of misinformation, for instance, exactly calling the constitutional amendment of a default clause when we were avoiding the default, at the same time saying that we were violating the spending cap when it was a very reasonable thing that was happening, because if inflation goes higher and you spend a little more, you are not increasing public expenditures in real terms. You are just spending unavoidable expenditures like Social Security and things like that. So, and anything you spend more this year because inflation went higher, nominally, you will spend less next year because the ceiling also comes down fast when inflation goes down. So we just synchronize it then. But of course, when you make the change, it opens one space, but one space that was immediately filled with vaccines and things that would demand anyway a side budget like we made last year. Instead of just pushing the button of emergency again, we preferred to make 2021 a transition year. So instead of asking again for extraordinary credits and extraordinary, so even we dispensed with the golden rule. We dispensed with the golden rule because the tax revenues went so fast with the economic recovery, which also people were denying. First, they all forecasts about the size of the drop of GDP were wrong. Then I always said Brazil would be back in a V-shaped recovery. There was an incredible increase in real revenues, not only nominal, but real revenues. So all these open an enormous space. So instead of going through a new emergency measure, state of emergency measure, we prefer that 2020 was the year of the disease. 2021, we were with the vaccinations, mass vaccinations, and the economy bouncing back, and a transition year. And then we go to your second question. So I'm optimistic. I think that the lower house approved it very fast. The higher house, the Senate, was a little more politically complex. We had trouble there, but finally we approved their version. Now the two versions must converge. And I think in any case, we'll get very much around our forecasts for the deficit and everything else, because in a sense, we really have a progress in our political coordination. Our government now, for the first time, we do have political support at the Congress. It was a very serious situation. In the first year, it was very tough. In the second year, Brazil also had a lot of political noise, but again, our democracy surprised on the upside, because we did cooperate even without such a solid political support. But now we do have a political support and coordination. The proof of that is that we have an independent central bank. We have the sanitation, we approved the water and sewage, cabotage, independent central bank, the fiscal triggers, privatization of postal service and Petrobras. So we are really approving bankruptcy law. There is another one, natural gas. So the concessions on oil. So the thing is really moving. The thing is really moving at the Congress now. It took us a couple of years to get political support, but we now got it. So we are optimistic about the thing, the final version being approved relatively rapidly. But then we go to the second question: is next year. What happens next year, and how do we see? Well, we will implement a lot of things that we have been cooking all this time, like, for instance, the micro reforms, because we went for the big ones first, like Social Security, like the regulatory frameworks, and but we also had a micro agenda, and we are following that, and they are very important. I'll give you some examples. Opening the economy, which is a macro agenda, but you need to make a lot of non-tariff agreements because you know that today 70-80% of the blockade against trade is based on improper regulation. So we have a big agenda on that. Same thing with, I call it, it's a big theme, it's a macro agenda, but the first steps have been given now, which is the green growth program. Brazil has to be a player. Brazil is the greenest matrix in the world, energy matrix in the world. So not only because most of our energy power was on hydroelectric, but also because we are advancing very fast on renewables. 15% already is renewables, is wind, is solar. So Brazil has to be a key player. We went to COP26 with an entirely reviewed position, with $1 billion of ourselves to fund the new programs. The NDB, the National New Development Bank of the BRICS, is helping us on sustainable energy, renewable energy. We had $700 million when we came here, and now is a $5 billion program with Brazil, most of it in infrastructure, green infrastructure. We are looking at gas from Argentina. We are looking at natural gas from Argentina. We are looking for natural gas all through the Brazilian coast to reindustrialize the country on a transition energy, which is natural gas. We are already beginning with green hydrogen, nuclear. So we are very much aware that Brazil is a very big country, very natural, a very powerful source of natural resource, and we understand that we have to preserve nature at the same time as we make this transition. So we are moving in this direction. And just to give you an idea of how favorable we see the future and how optimistic we are looking to the future, we have already more than $100 billion of commitments, investment commitments for the next 8 to 10 years, already signed. This is not forecast. This is not PowerPoint. This is signatures, commitments already signed on natural gas, concessions on railroads, on airports, on seaports, on oil. So it's happening. It's happening all over. We just approved the regulatory framework on sanitation. 1 week later, 1 week after that, $1 billion to the city of north of Brazil, in Alagoas, Maceió, the capital of Maceió, almost $1 billion of commitment there. And then 1 month after the regulatory market, then almost $10 billion on SEDAI, privatization of SEDAI. So, and we changed also our auction philosophy. Instead of asking a lot for the license, we inverted. You pay less for the license or for the auctioning fee, and you commit more in investments. So instead of having the idea of because we are divesting to reduce debt, we are less eager to extract money from the private sector when they want to invest in Brazil. So instead of asking you $1 billion to build a railroad, I ask you zero, and I ask you $2 billion of investments. So we changed our philosophy of auctions, and it has been a fantastic result. So we are having an enormous crowding in, which was our original view of what would happen with Brazil. First, we control, and one side you control public spending, and in the other side, you open Brazil as the widest investment frontier in the world today. So I just went now to the Middle East because of the raising price of oil. The petrodollars are there again to be recycled. So instead of doing like we did 20, 30 years ago, asking for credit, we're going there asking for partners. And just Emirates, we went to Emirates, we bounced it back with $10 billion of investment proposals for the coming years, all over, in gas, in seaports, even in soccer games. They want to buy even soccer teams in Brazil. So we are open for business.
Thank you very much, Mr. Guedes. And we are getting several questions from the audience about Petrobras. And I'd like to ask you about Petrobras privatization. So can we expect some preparatory steps to be taken before the elections next year? And can this process help raise funds to stabilize fuel prices, or would the sale proceeds be used with other purposes?
Well, the sales proceeds have a very natural track, which is they are part of our federal budget. So, and we keep selling, we keep auctioning oil, and the proceeds are already, they come not only the dividends of Petrobras, but also the auctions of the oil fields, everything. It's all accounted for on our budgets. Of course, the more we extract or the more we sell, the more we reinforce the budget, because our budgets are always very conservative. As the DNA of the Treasury to be very conservative in the budget forecasts. But what happened when you talk about privatization of Petrobras? The thing is, everybody knows that I'm in favor of privatizing all these companies. But the president separated. The president said, okay, you can sell postal service, you can sell Electrobras, you can sell and divest. Various state companies could divest their subsidiaries that are not in the core businesses. So we have a very clear policy of divesting and privatizing. But Petrobras is not in the list of privatization, at least for this first government. But what I was telling the president the other day, and that's why there was a lot of noise about this, I said, listen, we should go for the new market with Petrobras. You unlock more than $30 billion if you go to the same thing we are doing with Electrobras, which is to make it a corporation, which means destatizing the company. I am clearly in support of doing the same thing to Petrobras. So if one day in the future we announce that we want to go to the new market in Brazil, which means it will become a corporation, it always happens that the company will raise in value substantially because people understand that a private company has a higher multiple than a public company, a state company, So this is what happened. I am always in support of doing that, of going for the real thing. I always said that Brazil, the cycle of big state companies in Brazil is over. We had a lot of corruption in these companies. Petrobras was the focus of a huge corruption event. The Postal Service was a focus of a huge corruption event. So the public opinion is ready. They know that these companies were politically misused. And I think public opinion in Brazil are prepared to understand that the cycle of great state companies is over. It is a legacy of the military government. Then we had 30 years of social democrats in power. They also do not appreciate privatizations, but we are liberals. We are a political alliance of liberals and conservatives. And I think we should stand for that because the political campaign is coming and we must announce what will be our program. Well, as far as I am concerned, as a liberal, I'm in favor of privatizing Petrobras, of going for it. I think that it doesn't make sense to have a country that the state is very wealthy. We have $1 trillion in real estate, $1 trillion reals in real estate is almost $200 billion in real estate. It's probably the largest real estate company in the world is the Brazilian government. So, and we have another $1 trillion in values of state companies. At the same time, we have $2 trillion in receivables. So it's a very wealthy public sector and with a poor population. So we should not only make income transfers, but we should be very more aggressive in wealth transfers. We should sell these companies and transfer part of these resources to the poorest Brazilians. We can do a lot transferring income to poor people in Brazil. A proof of what happened was just during these pandemics. We sent money to the poorest people. It was the widest reduction in poverty in the last 40 years when we transferred $100 a month to poor people in Brazil. So we could sell these companies instead of reducing 100% of that. We should reduce, let's say, 80% of that, and 20% we should transfer to the poorest Brazilians. There is a fund for that, a fund for eradication of poverty. Is already 40 years old, this fund. This fund was 30 years old. This fund was created 30 years ago. But it was never, uh, uh, let's say, fed. So we should feed this fund, selling these companies, reducing that 80% of this money or 75% of this money, and transferring wealth to the poorest Brazilians. Let them have their houses, build their houses, pay for their home acquisitions and things like that. So we should be more aggressive. And I think that giving this political incentive, because today when you talk about privatizing, the politicians say, well, what do I gain with that? What is the use of that? You economists like privatizations to reduce that. But politically, what is the gain? So we should give them an incentive, which is, well, what about reducing poverty in Brazil? Is that a good enough incentive to sell these state companies and transfer part of the proceeds to the poor people? So I think this is going to be an issue during the campaign. And everybody knows where I will be in this campaign.
Fantastic, Minister. My next question, I think you already answered it partially, and we're getting here to the top of the half hour, so appreciate your time limitations. But I would kind of end with the last one here, Minister, is, so what would be the top 2 or 3 priorities for the next administration should President Bolsonaro win re-election? So you've already told us that one of them may very well be privatizing state-owned enterprises, Petrobras, and siphoning part of the revenue generated from that to some kind of social dividend. What other key priorities would you say would be on the program or top of the order in 2023 should Bolsonaro win re-election?
Well, we have an incomplete transition. We believe that Brazil was very successful in making the political transition. Our democracy is solid, like I always said. Our democracy surprised the world with important reforms, independent central bank, fiscal trigger, privatizations of Petrobras and postal service, the regulatory frameworks, making clear that the driver of the next sustainable growth decade in Brazil will be through the private investments. So we lived 20, 30 years where the driver of the economy were the public investments. And we sunk, Brazil sunk into a low trap, zero growth, poverty road. Our program is the road to prosperity. Our program is to transform the Brazilian economy in direction of a market economy, and certainly with social programs that reduce poverty, that reduce income inequality. So I would say, I'll give you an example. What would be the program for the next mandate? It's quite clear. It's to finish the job. So when we began with the Social Security reform, we advanced a lot, removing privileges, but we did not succeed in making it a capitalization system. We are still in a pay-as-you-go finance, which is a big, big mistake. So we should really reduce the cost of generating jobs in Brazil. We should make the rest of the Social Security reform allowing 40 million invisible labor force, informal markets. These guys could be contributing to the Social Security with capitalization individual accounts. So we should try to do it again. Same thing with the tax reform. We send a tax reform which is converging to OECD standards. In the last 40 years, corporate tax has been reduced all over the world from 44, 45% to 23.5%, which is the world average in OECD. Well, Brazil is 36, is very high. So our tax reform, the tax reform we sent to the Congress, proposed to charge dividends on 15%, which is lower than the average of OECD. So charge less the the corporations. The companies is where everything happens. It is in the company that you create jobs, you make investments, you increase the productivity of labor and pay higher wages, innovations, everything happens at the company level. So we should reduce corporate taxes and increase tax on dividends. If the money flows out of the company, then you tax the guy. So Brazil is all upside down. So we must finish the tax reform. At the same time, the consumption tax, it has to be a value-added tax. We proposed it. It's already there, the first step, which is the value-added tax at the federal level. And it is already there at the Congress also, the convergence with the proposal of also substituting for a value-added tax the ICMS and the ISS. So we converged at the end with the Senate. It is already in the Senate. It's a mixed commission in the Senate and the lower house. It is there, the proposal, but it was not approved because of the political, since we lost 1 year and a half fighting COVID, now elections are taking over, and then it's there, but our proposal is there. So I think that as soon as the president is elected, if this coalition of liberals and conservatives is renewed, I think the agenda is quite clear. Let's go for the second round of the capitalization scheme for exactly for the 40 million Brazilians. Will not mix around with the social security that is there. It is already there. Is the blue ship? Is the official social security scheme that we have? But what about the 38 million Brazilians that are informal workers? These guys need a social security for themselves, and we are going 2.0, 3.0, 4.0 with these guys. We're not going to condemn these guys to the old and obsolete labor market. They already live in a free market. So let's have just the minimum wage and a capitalization scheme for these guys. Companies should not pay tax on labor to create jobs. So we're going to propose what we call the yellow-green new regime for these guys. Same thing with the tax reform. Let's proceed with the tax reform. Same thing with the administrative reform. It's already there. We send it there. Let's follow on with the privatizations. Let's keep opening the economy. So the program is quite clear. We want to be, I think Brazil could be the third, the fourth, the fifth largest GDP in the world and per capita income if we go in the market direction. So we should never abandon the social security, the social programs. I would say Brazil, our program is a liberal Democrats. The party that does not exist in Brazil, I'm not into politics, but I would love a party called Lib Dem, the Liberal Democrats. The liberals, because we want a market economy, a very powerful market economy with a very reduced role of the government. But Democrats, so we know that the social programs transferring income to poor guys, it was our inspiration when the pandemics came. Immediately, I resorted to the minimum income program of Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman wrote this thing in 1950s. Amazingly, the Labour Party brought it to Brazil. PT approved the Bolsa Família in Brazil, which is not properly a minimum income, but it is a very interesting social program. When the pandemics hit us, we immediately went to the minimum income program. Let's give an income transfer of $100 for every Brazilian. So I think now we created Auxílio Brasil, which imposed itself. It was so successful that it displaced even better designed programs, socially with more incentives If you have two kids, if your kid is in school, there's a lot of social incentives that you can give. But the political success of the minimum income of Milton Friedman was so evident that the president said, well, forget about all this thing and let's go with the Auxílio Brasil again, which is a minimum income transfer program. So we must keep that in mind. We are liberals with the economy, but we are Democrats, and we understand that in a democracy, in a healthy democracy, there is a very important role for the state, which is exactly to remove social inequalities, to increase the opportunity, the equal opportunities, to give vouchers for education, for health. So it's quite clear. Our program is quite clear.
Fantastic, Mr. Guedes, Minister. It's been an extraordinary pleasure to be able to speak with you here today. I think this was a great conversation and very important to distinguish the signal from the noise, to use the analogy that you often like to make reference to. I'd like to be able to thank your participation here, all of us who joined in. And if you have any last words before signing off, please, give you the opportunity to be able to have some concluding remarks.
As my final words would be, I'm not selling dreams. I'm giving you hard facts, 700 billion reais, more than $100 billion in commitments, investment commitments. I'm also with hard facts on the fiscal front. I'm also with hard facts on the reforms, independent central bank. For the first time in history, there will be a transition where the central bank will be doing the proper job instead of just trying to be politically convenient. Same thing with all the regulatory frameworks that we changed. Same thing with sanitation, health, gas, natural gas, an open frontier, wide open frontier for investment in Brazil, and the fiscal responsibility. These are facts. But I'm not selling dreams. It's going to be a tough year because we are fighting inflation. And we had an adverse supply shock with this disconnection of the supply chains. So inflation is going higher. And certainly with an independent central bank fighting this inflation, there will be a sharp deceleration in growth potential. But we are talking about next year. So next year, instead of growing 3-4%, we'll probably grow much less than that. But I would like to again be very skeptical of the forecasts that have been wrong year after year about Brazil. First, that we would never make reforms. Second, that we would collapse under COVID and Brazil GDP would collapse 10% and stay in a depression. When I said about the V-shaped recovery, people said that we were dreaming because the V was V of virtual, it would never happen. And then Brazil bounced back very sharply. We did not destroy jobs like in the last two recessions when there was a net destruction of 3 million jobs. Quite the contrary, in Brazil, we preserved jobs in 2020, and we are creating more than 3 million jobs from the bottom to the moment, 300,000 every month. So these are facts. It's going to be a tough year. We'll be raising interest rates. There will be a lot of political noise again, a lot of fake news in one side and the other. But I wanna say that I believe and I trust on Brazilian institutions. I believe and I trust that the president will stay committed to the liberal road to prosperity. I believe and trust that the Congress will keep helping us to the very last day. I really believe that we will privatize the postal service and Petrobras next year. And I would not be surprised if we advance with more reforms, even in an election year. So I'll be fighting for that here. I think the economic team is fighting for that. And I invite you to observe with the sharp view that Eurasia was one of the sharpest analytics of what was going in Brazil. So I'm very pleased to be talking to you guys because you were always very sharp looking to the signals and not falling victims of the noise. Be one side or be the other. You were never taken by the wind. You were always looking for the signs. So I thank you again for the opportunity of talking to you, and let's all have good Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, and let's see next year a lot of action.
Fantastic, Minister. Thank you so much for the kind words there at the end of your comments. We very much appreciate that and the time that you gave us. And for all of our clients who are logged in right now, I would invite everybody to dial in again tomorrow. We have another full lineup here for our second day of our Latin America Summit. And thank you so much, Minister, for kind of finishing in a high note here our first day. Thank you so much for dialing in. And until tomorrow, and have a good rest of the year as well.
Thank you, friends.
Take care.